Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrea Kalea, and I'm the Director of Learning and Executive Director at Helios Salinger. I'm really excited to welcome you to this webinar today to celebrate Privacy Awareness Week. Now, before I begin, I wish to acknowledge that I speak to you from the land of the Cammeraygal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this beautiful land. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, we've got several hundred people on this call today, which is just fantastic. But before I get stuck into the topic, some quick housekeeping. Please note that we will be recording this webinar and we will make the video available shortly. I should also remind you that this presentation does not constitute legal advice and should not be construed or relied upon as legal advice by any party. Also, we ask that you do not screenshot or copy the content of this webinar. However, as I did mention, a video will be made available shortly. I will also add links to useful resources into the Q&A function of the webinar as we go today. We will also be running some exercises using Mentimeter during the webinar, so please don't miss out. Have your phones handy as we go. So let's get started. The webinar today is Diffusing AI Landmines, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Anna Johnston, who will be running this presentation for you today. Anna, as many of you know, is one of Australia's most respected experts in privacy law and practice. After serving as the Deputy Privacy Commissioner in New South Wales, in 2004, Anna established Salinger Privacy. And in 2024, Salinger Privacy joined Helios, and we're now known as Helios Salinger. Helios Salinger is a team of governance, risk and compliance specialists in privacy, AI and data governance. And for over 20 years, our consultants have provided privacy compliance and privacy by design advice on complex projects, which often involve data linkage and de-identification challenges. So that's it from me. Anna, over to you.
Well, thank you, Andrea. Welcome, everyone, and happy Privacy Awareness Week. For those of you who don't already know Andrea, she's our fabulous Director of Learning. She facilitates our IAPP certification programs like AIGP and SIP-M. We're really excited with the announcement this week that there will be an IAPP certification program in Australian privacy law coming soon. So we look forward to our team and Andrea delivering on that for you as well. And she delivers those courses amongst other courses which earn her rave reviews from our participants. As of this year, Andrea has also taken over as Executive Director, managing the entire Helios Salinger team. So let's get started with today's topic. So as privacy professionals, we know that the way personal information is processed can have really significant impacts on individuals and on communities. That's why we do risk assessments like privacy impact assessments. It's why we build in risk mitigation strategies using frameworks like privacy by design. But the nature of AI, automated decision making and algorithmic systems in general mean that sometimes we need to go beyond what might be contained in a standard PIA approach. And that's because these new technologies create particular challenges in terms of compliance with privacy law, and because the scale and the scope of that human impact from those technologies has the potential to be so much greater than previously. So my objective in this webinar today is to offer you a framework to use when you are thinking about AI and similar systems. The 4Ds framework is how we can start to tease apart both the risks and the potential solutions for you. Importantly, the 4Ds framework is not a legal compliance check. Privacy risks in AI systems must, of course, be managed within the existing regulatory environment, which includes privacy law, but also copyright law, consumer protection law, anti-discrimination law, and so on. So I'm not going to explore the AI regulatory landscape today. Instead, the 4Ds framework is a separate, jurisdiction agnostic, but complementary way of conceptualizing what you might need to think about. I'll also be framing this in the context of advice drawn from our team's years of experience conducting privacy impact assessments and other types of risk assessments of projects for our clients. And primarily today's presentation is about how to avoid landmines. I chose that analogy deliberately because landmines are hidden, they're below the surface. So up ahead, it all looks fine, but if you don't tread carefully, or if you don't have a way to sniff out the landmines and defuse them first, boom. All of which translates into advice on the steps you should be taking and the landmines you should be able to avoid in order to achieve effective, responsible, and trustworthy AI. So those are my objectives for today. But your objective is to learn like a rat. A couple of years ago, I enjoyed a brilliant holiday in Cambodia, and a most surprising highlight was a visit to see rats. There's a Belgian charity called Apopo which trains these giant African pouched rats to sniff out landmines in countries like Cambodia dealing with the aftermath of war. They call them hero rats because of the lives that they save. We watched the trainers teaching those hero rats how to sniff out explosives, and it was absolutely brilliant. So your objective today is to learn how to sniff out landmines just like a hero rat. And much like the way hero rats are trained, we will be playing a game to help you learn. The aim of the game is to sniff out the landmines in order to avoid or defuse them so that you can navigate a safe path towards building or implementing effective, responsible, and trustworthy AI. As we progress through the 4 days framework, our game master Andrea will be running a few rounds of quiz questions, as she said, using Mentimeter. Okay, so let's begin. Our team established the 4 days framework for assessing AI systems so that you can minimise privacy harms, understand what kinds of biases or risks might occur when, and start to identify appropriate solutions. The 4 days framework captures the various components of creating or implementing an AI system, which are design, data, development, and deployment. Each of these 4 components has their own challenges, questions, and considerations. First, design. What are your design objectives? What are the design principles that will guide the project? Second, data. You will need to think about what data will be used to train the system, to test and validate the system, and then use the system, and whether all the associated data flows have been lawfully authorised. Third is development. You will need to explore how the system will be developed or procured. And finally, deployment. You'll need to examine how the system will be rolled out and managed after rollout. So we will talk about each of these 4 Ds in turn. And as we go, I will highlight some lessons learned by our team and warn you about the landmines you need to avoid or defuse. So please think of the 4 days framework as a tool to help you find those potential landmines and as a set of strategies for avoiding or diffusing them as well. So let's start with design. Responsible AI and algorithmic systems feature privacy risk management long before any personal information is used in a live scenario. Ideally, consideration of privacy and related issues should start as early as when your design objectives are being formed. While it might seem obvious and trite, having a clear understanding of why a system is being created or implemented and whose interests it's going to serve is really essential. Last year, the OAIC found that Kmart had breached the Privacy Act when it introduced facial recognition. In response, a company spokesperson said, like most other retailers, Kmart is experiencing escalating incidents of theft in stores, which are often accompanied by antisocial behaviour or acts of violence. So that's 3 different justifications given publicly for why this store needed facial recognition technology: theft, antisocial behaviour, and acts of violence. None of which were the same as the justification put to the OAIC at the time, which was fraud prevention. Now, this Kmart case is currently under appeal, but nonetheless, I think this point will remain valid. If your own organisation is not clear about the business case for your use of AI, it's going to make it very difficult for you to conduct a proper risk assessment. Without a really clear understanding of the business case and all of the associated use cases for the technology, you can't properly check for legal compliance, nor can you design the right business processes to support the use of technology, train your staff, or communicate honestly with your customers, let alone make a compelling argument to the regulator. So one way to avoid that landmine is to ensure that your organisation has clearly articulated the objective or problem and the allowable use cases before looking to adopt an AI solution. In other words, find a solution that meets your needs, not the other way around. Vague, hand-wavy statements like AI will save us money or AI will make our staff more productive is wishful thinking. It's not an articulated problem, nor is it a business case. Even if you have a clear business problem to solve, if we use the test articulated by the Privacy Commissioner in determinations in the past year or so, you will need to think about whether the AI solution is going to first actually work. In other words, will it achieve its stated business objective? But also, is there a less privacy intrusive alternative available? And finally, you have to think about, will the AI solution be proportionate, which involves balancing the privacy impacts from the use of the tool or the system against the business benefits obtained from its use. Which leads us to the next topic, success metrics. You need to know if your system is going to achieve the business objective in your business case. But there's another potential landmine here, which is if you only look at one metric in isolation. In July last year, the Commonwealth Bank announced 45 customer service roles would be cut as it introduced an AI-powered voice bot. At the time, the bank's spokesperson said, "Our investment in technology, including AI, is making it easier and faster for our customers to get help, especially in our call centres." But the finance sector union claimed that the experience of workers after the bot was introduced was a very different story. Call volumes were rising, with management scrambling to offer overtime and even pulling team leaders onto the phones. By the end of August, the bank had reversed its decision. So, what's the lesson here? Make sure your definition of success is holistic. Don't just look at one metric like time spent per call, look also at accuracy rates. And look at downstream impacts like, is there any rework required? Have customer complaints gone up? Has customer satisfaction been impacted? Has worker morale gone down? So our suggestion to diffuse that landmine is to very carefully and holistically define success. In other words, what does it mean or what will it mean for the system to be working? So first, you will need to establish a baseline for each metric to reflect how things are today before you introduce the new system. Then you will need to carefully define a range of success metrics, but importantly, also your failure metrics. In other words, you need a way to anticipate, define, and measure unwanted side effects. For example, if your success metric is performs better than a human, you will also need failure metrics like false positives and false negatives. If your success metric is time saved on a task, you will also need failure metrics like decreased accuracy of outcomes. And then you'll need to test against those success metrics and the failure metrics. So how do you do that in practice? Our third topic is the methodology to use to find out if your system will achieve those success metrics, but also whether it's going to introduce any of those unwanted side effects. So you'll need to develop a plan to test, monitor, and scrutinize the AI system closely to ensure it performs as intended on data reflecting your own customers or community. And you'll need to ensure that it works under real-world conditions. As an example, I found this news story about the evaluation of an AI decision assistance tool really interesting. Interesting enough that I went and read the whole medical journal article about it too, which gave a slightly different story. First, here there was a clear and compelling public interest business case based on trying to solve a genuine problem, which is that misinterpretation of chest x-rays can result in misdiagnosis or delays in the management of patients, resulting in poorer patient outcomes. For example, a delay in the administration of antibiotics for a serious chest infection increases the risk of death. This is an example where the metric for success is to reduce the rate of diagnostic errors made by doctors reviewing chest x-rays in hospital emergency departments, so a very high pressure environment. The purpose of this particular evaluation of the developed tool was to assess against three questions. First, the impact on human decision-making when using an AI tool. Does it impact rates of correct diagnosis? In other words, does using the AI tool help the human to do a better, by which we mean more accurate, job? Second, what is the impact on human performance when we introduce AI? How do doctors react when the AI tool produces inaccurate suggestions? For example, does the tool introduce automation bias? And third, how is using the tool going to impact the time taken? Is there going to be an efficiency gain, or in fact, is time lost? So the evaluation involved 200 doctors working across 5 Sydney hospital emergency departments. The chest x-rays were representative of a range of conditions from fractures and infections to heart failure and cancer. But this study wasn't undertaken in the emergency room when facing real patients. It was conducted retrospectively on historic patient records. So doctors were asked to make their diagnosis from the x-ray and from an accompanying description of symptoms. In a random selection, half the x-rays were then supplemented with an AI tool's suggested diagnosis. And around a quarter of the slides deliberately contained x-rays known to produce incorrect suggestions by the AI tool. Now, the results of this evaluation were great. Use of the AI assistance tool helped doctors make the right diagnosis. So combining humans with AI prevented a misdiagnosis in 1 in 17 cases. Time was not saved, it was actually increased, but the extra time taken per patient was measured in seconds, not even minutes. But the newspaper story about this study didn't mention that there was also a warning from the authors in terms of the second success metric about the impact on human decision-making when introducing an AI assistance tool. The researchers said, although participants were instructed to approach the study as if treating a real patient, the clinical vignettes were simulated. Therefore, any diagnostic errors had no consequences. The authors suggested that more work was needed to check for automated bias once this tool was deployed in a real-world environment where patients' lives and doctors' reputations are on the line. So that's your next strategy to diffuse landmines. Understanding that evaluation against your success metrics should not be a one and done. One of our clients used a complex 3-stage approach to evaluating an AI tool. First, they did a retrospective trial where the tool would read and generate results against a large number of historic cases. So results were analysed against past human-determined decisions and customer outcomes to assess the accuracy and performance of the tool compared to human decision makers. The second stage, once it passed the first test, the second stage was a prospective trial where the tool was used in real live scenarios with real live customers. But it was treated a bit like a kid on work experience, told to look but don't touch. The machine could offer its interpretation, but its interpretation was not used in relation to that customer. The results from the tool and its performance, as compared side by side to human decision makers across a very large number of decisions, were then monitored and evaluated by the project team with a number of questions in mind, including what would the impact have been for this customer on this day if the tool had been used instead of the human on that day. And then, having passed that stage, they moved to implementation, and that's when the tool is operationally deployed to start to replace some human decision makers. And the performance of the tool will be subject to ongoing monitoring and evaluation post-deployment. Now, there are some more landmines to avoid when conducting your evaluation of an AI tool. One way your evaluation methodology might not be suitable is if the data used to test the tool turns out to be the same data used to build the underlying AI model. In 2021, 2 major studies assessed hundreds of COVID-related predictive tools that were developed at the peak of the pandemic. And both of these studies found that researchers repeated the same basic errors in the way they trained or tested their tools. Understandably, information about COVID patients was being collected and shared in a rush, and often by the doctors struggling to treat those patients. Researchers wanted to help quickly, so they took whatever data sets they could get publicly. But this meant that some tools ended up being tested on the same data that they'd been trained on, which made them appear far more accurate than they really were. This causes evaluation bias. A second cause of evaluation bias is when the data set used for testing your system does not appropriately represent the population that the system will be deployed upon in the real world, or when the testing environment does not replicate real-world conditions. So that was the scenario in the chest X-ray evaluation I just mentioned. So to avoid that landmine, you will need to ensure that the data used to test is different to the data used to train the model in the first place, and that the data used to test reflects your real-world data, your real-world conditions, your users, your data subjects. Okay, so that wraps up our first D of design. Now it's time to test your skills with a quiz question.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anna. So now it's time to do our Mentimeter. Clearview AI is a facial recognition technology sold as a tool for law enforcement agencies to identify unknown individuals suspected of crimes, and typically by submitting stills taken from CCTV. Clearview AI claimed to generate 100% accurate facial recognition matches. The testing dataset on which they based that claim contained clear images such as formal portrait photos of 834 people, all of whom were known public figures, such as American politicians. So the question for all of you is, what is the landmine they stepped on? There are 4 possible answers. It's the landmine isolated success metric, business case is not persuasive, reputation risk, or evaluation bias. The test doesn't reflect real-world conditions. Looks like most people are choosing that 4th option, evaluation bias. And if you did select that, you are correct. That is most definitely the right answer. So real world conditions involve photos of people who are not publicly known, realistically are taken under quite bad conditions, such as low light or CCTV stills. And these are used to compare against social media photos, which again are less likely to be professional headshots. So whereas the testing data set in this situation included professional headshots, which were matched against other professional headshots. So that is it for our first D. Anna, if you would like to take us on to our second D, please.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, this is possibly the most obvious of the 4D components. You'll need to think about the data that will be used to train, test, and validate the system. And then once it's deployed, what data will the system collect, use, generate, or disclose? First up, think about the lawfulness of collecting, generating, using, or disclosing the data. Compliance with the collection, use, and disclosure privacy principles are not the only issues to think about with respect to data. You also need to think about data quality, or if you like, whether the data is fit for purpose. Reliance on poor quality data is how an AI system's poor privacy practices might lead to downstream harms like discrimination. Again, we can learn some lessons from the reviews of AI tools developed during the pandemic. One group trained its AI model using a data set that contained a mix of scans taken when patients were lying down or standing up. Because patients scanned while lying down were more likely to be seriously ill with COVID, the AI learned wrongly to predict COVID risk from a person's position. And some AI models were found to be picking up on the font that certain hospitals use to label their scans. As a result, the fonts used in the hospitals that were carrying the most serious caseloads of patients, the font became the predictor of COVID risk. So the landmine is when the training data is not fit for purpose, such as if the training data is unlabeled and you can't control for those problems. So the flip side, of course, is to ensure that the training data is fit for purpose and labelled appropriately. And while we're still on the topic of data, although organisations may be looking to introduce an AI system to carry out a single activity, oftentimes that activity or project will involve multiple different uses or disclosures of personal information. So across the AI system lifecycle for a project, personal information might be collected or used to develop, train, and refine the AI model, test, evaluate, and then calibrate the AI model, as inputs for AI systems deployed in production environments, and for monitoring and improvement activities, which may extend to machine learning activities designed to continually improve the underlying model. And where these activities involve data being provided to a third party, such as back to the developer of an AI system, this will often involve a disclosure of personal information as well. Also remember that your AI tool supplier might provide updated versions over time. So you might need to think about the data flows involved if you will be using your own customer data to validate any of those software updates in a test environment before introducing them to your production environment. For each purpose involving a collection, use, or disclosure of personal information, you must first establish a lawful basis under the privacy principles to permit that collection, use, or disclosure, or else you risk legal non-compliance. So your landmine here is that there may be no legal basis for some data flows. Thinking again about the use case of facial recognition-enabled CCTV in a retail environment. Let's assume the business objective is to be able to identify and deal with problematic customers, such as those with a history of violence. For that use case, we would typically find a lot of discussion about the legality of collecting biometrics from all customers at the point at which you or I would enter the store. But that type of facial recognition system can only work if you already have a database of images to compare against. If you like, a blacklist comprising a set of photos of the bad guys the store wants to keep out. So you need to not only look at the data flows involved when all your everyday customers walk into a store, but also at the quite different data flows that were involved in the creation and then maintenance of the blacklist. For one of our clients, their initial legal advice and risk assessment only considered the data flows that would occur once the system was deployed. And for that, they could rely on customer consent as the legal pathway to allow the collection and use of that customer's data to occur. But we had found that what they had missed in that initial analysis were other data flows that would also be using their customers' data without the customer's consent. So these included using their customer data to evaluate competing AI tools during the procurement phase. With each subsequent release of an updated tool, there would be a further use of customers' data to reevaluate or validate the tool before deploying it into the production environment. And the chosen AI supplier planned to reuse their customers' data for ongoing machine learning and product development. So each one of those use cases involve different data flows. Each data flow needs its own legal pathway to allow it to occur, and consent was not always available as an option to authorize that data flow. So the key lesson here is to test for compliance against the collection, use and disclosure privacy principles right up front in any thinking about your AI systems for all the possible different data flows. You need to tease apart all those data flows and then identify the possible legal pathway for each one so that you can hopefully get the green light to proceed. But sometimes you might find that there is simply no way to get that green light. You'll need to look for other legal pathways, or you might to rethink the project entirely. The next landmine is a failure to check for bias in the data before building an AI tool. An AI system which reinforces stereotypes demonstrates how harms of representation might manifest themselves. In 2024, Channel 9 was forced to apologise after they showed a photo of a female member of Parliament on the TV news, which had been digitally altered. They had turned the original photo of the MP, who was in a dress, they'd turned that into a photo of her wearing a crop top bearing her midriff, and her breasts had also been digitally enlarged. 9 News blamed an automation error in Photoshop for producing the edited image. So then tech writer Cam Wilson from Crikey set out to find out what the software would do to photos of other politicians in everyday outfits like t-shirts if it was left on autopilot. He found that female MPs were put into bikinis while male MPs were put in suits. So, if the dataset used to train your AI system reflects historic bias, which is highly likely if it was built from scraping content from the internet, your AI model is going to produce outputs featuring sexism, racism, and every other kind of bias and discriminatory content, but on steroids. So the appropriate strategy to diffuse that landmine is to ensure that your risk assessment takes a holistic view of harms. This includes the traditional privacy harms we immediately think of, like data breaches or unlawful access to personal information, but also more downstream privacy-related harms, such as discrimination arising from the use of inaccurate data or biased systems. So you will need to think about who is represented in the training data set and how they are represented. as well as who is not represented. And you might need some expert assistance to help your organisation test for bias in that data. Okay, that wraps up our discussion of the second D data. On to round 2 of our game. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Anna. This question relates to the second D, which is data. So here we go. The Finnish language is gender neutral, meaning there is no he or she pronoun in the written language. So when you use Google Translate to translate Finnish into English, Google's AI chooses a gendered pronoun depending on the rest of the sentence. As a result, the AI predicts that if you're talking about a person who is smart and who is the boss, well, perhaps you're talking about a man. And if you're talking about someone who takes care of children and enjoys manicures, well, that might just be a woman. So the question for all of you is, what is the landmine which is reflected here? We have again 4 possible answers. Is it unauthorized data flows, isolated success metric, unlabeled training data, or biased data where the training data reflects historical bias? I'll give everyone a few seconds to answer that question. Let's see how some of you are travelling. And it is looking to me like we've got a pretty strong showing with that 4th option. So I'll show you the correct answer. The correct answer, not surprisingly, is the 4th one, biased data. The training data reflects historic bias. So I suppose to understand that, the machine learned from historic data in this example. It reflected sources from the past, which would suggest that it's more statistically likely that outcomes were for, a boss equals a man, or a childcare equals a woman. So I hope you got that one right. Well done, Anna. We had a very strong finding with that second D. Back to you.
Thanks, Andrea. So on to our third D, development. The development stage includes both building and testing the system. For organisations developing their own algorithmic systems, now is the time to put that earlier design thinking and considerations about data into action to inform how the system is built and tested. But for most of us, this stage will mean purchasing a product or service. Now, sadly, given my love of alliteration, purchasing and procurement do not start with the letter D, so we might also call this D for doing due diligence and dealing with the developer. Now, you can outsource development, but you can't outsource your responsibilities. If you are procuring AI, you will need to ensure that off-the-shelf products are rigorously examined and tested before deployment and fine-tuned for your operational context. You can't simply outsource your responsibility through procurement and hope to avoid liability for any harms caused. For example, in both Australia and Canada, the police forces which used the Clearview AI product were found in breach of privacy laws because of their use of that product. So the strategy to diffuse that landmine is to manage your suppliers appropriately. If you haven't already seen it, the OAIC has published some helpful guidance on privacy and the use of commercially available AI products, which highlights some of the privacy risks you should expect to manage when procuring AI systems. But the risk doesn't stop at procurement. Following your supplier and product selection and due diligence processes, you will need to ensure that you have appropriate contracts in place, setting out the rights and responsibilities of each party. Include key clauses with appropriate privacy, security, data breach response, and incident management requirements. Also, contracts should clearly set out how and where data will be handled, processed, stored, and ultimately returned or destroyed. Organisations should also have a plan for ongoing monitoring or auditing of supplier performance and compliance with their contractual obligations. And don't forget to consider if there are overseas or interstate disclosures involved, and if so, what extra steps you might need to take to ensure you're compliant with your privacy cross-border disclosure obligations too. The next landmine to consider is that even if you have the law on your side, you may face reputational risk from your use of customer data to train AI models. In 2024, Cam Wilson, the technology journalist, published a story titled "Australia's Biggest Medical Imaging Lab is Training AI on its Scan Data. Patients Have No Idea." Prompted by Wilson's story, the OAIC began a preliminary inquiry into the disclosure of medical imaging scans by IMED to Annalise AI, a former joint venture between IMED and Harrison AI. So there was plenty of negative press about IMED as a result of the Crikey story and because of the OAIC's subsequent decision to make inquiries. But 7 months later, the OAIC closed its inquiry. IMED was found to not be in breach of the Privacy Act because it supplied de-identified patient imaging records to the third party in order to train their AI diagnostic model. So that matter had turned on a legal argument that IMED did not need to provide notice or gain patients' consent because the data had been appropriately de-identified, and IMED effectively won that argument. But they still faced reputational risk because of their lack of transparency about their practices. So notwithstanding the fact that the Privacy Commissioner eventually agreed with IMED that they did not need patient consent for this disclosure to occur, when I booked in for an X-ray a short while later, I found that IMED had changed its business process and was, at that time anyway, seeking express consent for the use of patient data from X-rays, even when in a de-identified form, in order to develop AI models. So this shift in business practices to start seeking consent, even after the company had successfully convinced the regulator of their legal argument that they did not need to rely on consent, this shift points to the critical importance of ensuring not only legal compliance, but also ensuring that you have social license to proceed. So the takeaway lesson here is that just because an activity complies with the law does not mean that you have social license to operate. So your strategy to diffuse this landmine is to ask, will your customers or stakeholders accept this system? Okay, Andrea, time for round 3 of our game.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna. So here it is. In order to examine whether an AI solution would be acceptable to its community, one of our clients, a health service, commissioned their own social research, which included 3 things, amongst others: exploring community levels of understanding of AI, community views on the use of this technology in the healthcare setting, as well as what information patients would want to know in order to alleviate their concerns. So the question for all of you is, what is the landmine the health service was diffusing with this strategy? There are 4 possible answers to this one. Was it trying to reduce reputation risk, unauthorised data flows, biased data, or was there a lack of success metrics? Let's see how you go. Choose one of these 4 possible answers. And it's looking like the first one, reputation risk, may be the winner this time round. Okay, let's do it. The correct answer is, not surprisingly, reputation risk. So engaging with stakeholders early, really important strategy to help not only identify, but then manage any problems. And sometimes it can simply just be a matter of communication. So that is it for our 3rd D. Anna, if you'd like to take us into the last D.
Thanks, Andrea. So our final D is for the deployment stage. Once a system is deployed into the real world, organisations cannot simply wash their hands of the system and let it run wild. Bias and misuse can still be introduced at this point. So your system may need to be changed to deal with real world inputs. So you may need to integrate real-time feedback loops, for example. Another key area for privacy professionals to consider at deployment is how individuals will be meaningfully informed about how the system is used in practice and how they may seek more information or exercise review rights. Decisions should be explainable and auditable. So, our final landmines to avoid under this final D include landmine number 10. This is business practices which effectively incentivize misuse. These days, when we think about AI in the workplace, generative AI or Gen AI might be the first example to spring to mind. But use of Gen AI to write marketing content, for example, is a very different use case to feeding it sensitive customer records to generate reports. So there is a landmine here. If your organisation incentivizes speed or rewards volume or turnover of work, then your staff will be tempted to use public AI tools in a risky manner, even when they have been told not to. For example, in Victoria, a child protection worker was found to have entered significant amounts of personal information, including the name of an at-risk child, into ChatGPT in around 100 cases in order to draft child protection related documents, such as reports then submitted to court. The worker admitted to using ChatGPT to save time and to present their work more professionally. So as well as incentivising quality and accuracy and compliance, instead of speed or volume, you should be thinking about what other guardrails you need to allow innovation to proceed safely. You need to think about clear guidance for staff about what tools they can and can't use, in what circumstances, and for what business purposes or functions. And implement user training for your own systems and staff training for public tools such as ChatGPT. Research by KPMG and the University of Melbourne found that Australians have amongst the lowest levels of AI training out of the 47 countries represented in their survey. So this points to a real need to uplift AI literacy in most organisations. AI literacy needs to be developed for all staff from the execs down. And you should be developing an AI policy for your organisation to lay out your ground rules. Now, we're not quite done with the landmines yet. A couple of final ones. First, non-compliance with new legal rules about transparency. The Tranche 1 reforms to the Privacy Act passed in 2024 require organisations regulated by the Federal Privacy Act to tighten up their practices. In particular, the new rules regarding the content of privacy policies require you to take active steps to ensure compliance by reviewing and updating your privacy policy now to reflect your use of AI or other automated decision-making systems. A failure to adequately prepare for commencement of that rule, which is December this year, that could leave you at risk of non-compliance and regulatory action. We know the OAIC has already commenced a compliance scan of privacy policies. And for those of you who are public sector agencies in Western Australia or businesses which serve as contracted service providers to Western Australian government, the new transparency rules about AI go even further. The new PRIS Act commences in July this year. And that PRIS Act introduces new requirements for automated processes making significant decisions about individuals. Those organisations will be required to conduct impact assessments, which include a requirement to have regard to the elimination or minimisation of harm bias, and discrimination. You'll also need to notify and inform individuals of the automated decision-making process used and provide a process by which the individual can request human intervention in relation to the decision. So, how to defuse that landmine? Transparency is key. This also builds on that earlier strategy about know your community. By understanding the needs and attitudes of your customers when it comes to AI systems, you'll be better placed to develop nuanced communication strategies and layered privacy messaging to support your customers with different levels of knowledge and interest in AI, while also being able to explain the benefits of using AI and how the technology works. And one final landmine you might not have seen coming, which we found really threw one of our clients for a loop, just as they are about to launch their AI tool. The use of AI can raise novel legal questions, so you might need legal advice, and getting this might be quite slow and quite expensive because a body of case law around the use of AI has not yet been established. And meanwhile, your investment in an AI tool has been delayed, or even worse, it may be utterly undermined if your stakeholders refuse to use the tool because of fear about their own legal liability when relying on an AI tool to help them make their decisions. So the final strategy is to avoid that landmine by obtaining approval from the appropriate person with authority to accept any of those residual risks that the AI use case might bring, to reflect, and that acceptance of risks must reflect your enterprise's risk appetite. And this needs to include anticipating the risk that your shiny new AI system won't get used at all because of liability fears. Okay, Andrea, now for the moment you've been waiting for, the final round of our game to sniff out the landmines.
What are you saying, Anna? You think I enjoy a good quiz or a good game? Absolutely, I do. And here's our fourth question. It relates to the fourth D, that of deployment. Your business supplies an AI-powered recruitment tool to companies and public sector agencies alike. And not surprisingly, you'll use that this tool for your recruitment practices as well. You're in the process of updating your privacy policy to reflect your use of AI, and you've alerted your Western Australian government clients that you are ready to partner with them on an AI impact assessment as required under the PRIS Act. So what is the landmine that you are diffusing with this particular plan? Again, we have 4 possible answers. Does it relate to unlabeled training data, or evaluation method, fear of liability, or new legal rules? So let's see. Interesting. Majority of people are choosing new legal rules, but we do have some responses around fear of liability. So our correct answer, let's see, is new legal rules. You do need to be alive to legal challenges without a doubt. And this might mean that there's some new substantial compliance requirements. In the new Western Australian privacy law, as Anna mentioned, AI impact assessments will be required, and both the Australian and WA laws require that privacy policies reflect the use of AI, such as in automated decision-making systems.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and congratulations to our new class of hero rats. You have been well trained to sniff out landmines in AI projects. So today we introduced the 4Ds framework as a way for you to conceptualise the breadth of issues to be considered. We've also offered you various strategies to help you avoid or diffuse 12 different landmines in AI projects. These landmines and strategies have been drawn from our ebook on this topic, Algorithms, AI and Automated Decisions, a Guide for Privacy Professionals. There we explain the 4Ds framework and these topics in more detail, And we've produced a set of criteria by which to assess whether the AI system you are building or buying will be trustworthy, responsive, and effective. So we've produced for you a free extract from that ebook, which is a checklist of 67 questions to ask about an AI project to get to the heart of designing a trustworthy system. You can download a copy of the checklist using the link in the Q&A or use the QR code on the screen now. So just quickly to wrap up, here's a few takeaways. Assessing AI tools and systems for privacy-related risks and harms is essential. And due to the growth of AI and automated decision-making systems and regulatory and community concerns about AI in particular, we're likely to see an increasing need for this kind of work and skill set. Privacy professionals should ensure that they're involved in assessing privacy and related risks throughout the life cycle of an AI system's development and deployment. Also, privacy professionals need to up literacy around AI systems so you can engage in discussions with your project teams, with the IT team, and with your procurement team. Andrea runs a small group program called Assessing Privacy Risks in AI, which uses a hypothetical scenario so you can really dive deeper into identifying risks and coming up with solutions. And final takeaway is to update your PIA framework to reflect these landmines. Our team can obviously help you with that. So in terms of other resources, we do have some more free stuff for you this week. In addition to the checklist that you can download, as mentioned, we have a free handbook on privacy management. Our groundbreaking research into privacy maturity levels across Australian organisations, and plenty of blogs, including those covering a number of topics mentioned today. But of course, our team also needs to earn a crust, which we do by offering privacy training, consulting, and pragmatic compliance resources. Please do take a look at our website or get in touch with our team if you're interested in any of our compliance products, training courses, or advisory services. Okay, that's it from me. Back to Andrea. Thank you to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for sharing your expertise and that great insight into AI landmines and building it around the 4Ds framework, which is very memorable. So that is it from the team at Helios Salinger today. Before you go, we would love your feedback. We very much welcome it. So please take a minute to answer our feedback survey. The link to that is in the Q&A, or you can use the QR code on the screen now. So otherwise, from the whole team here at Helios Salinger, we'd like to thank you for joining us and, of course, wish you a very happy Privacy Awareness Week. Thank you.